Okay, we're going to continue with our lectures on angiosperms, and specifically today we're talking about fleshy fruits. So different fruit types, and our next lecture will be on dry fruits. So just a quick lecture outline here. There's a poster that shows a classification of fruits, and we'll talk about simple, aggregate, and multiple fruits also in this lecture. So we've already talked about a little bit about fruit arrangement, which we did a couple weeks ago. And today we're going to focus on the development and morphology, and then also looking at different types of fleshy fruits. And we're learning these in lab. So you've had your lab sheets that talk about what fruit type it is. And so hopefully if you were a little confused about what we were looking at in lab, this lecture will help clear some of that up. And so today there's three main types of fleshy fruits that we'll focus on. These are unique to woody plants. There are other types of fleshy fruits for other plants that we don't study in this course, but drupes, berries, and pomes are the main type of fleshy fruits that we see in woody plants. So first of all, I want to do a quick review about our flowers, which we did last week. So I've got a few questions for you. One, what is the difference between the gynoecium and the carpel? Question two, what parts make up the carpel? There are three parts of each carpel. Three, where are the ovules located? Four, what's the difference between an ovule and a seed? And finally, what happens between pollination and fertilization? What process happens there? Okay, if you missed a couple of those and you want to do a quick review, I'm going to go through that quickly, right? So difference between the gynoecium and the carpel, remember that the gynoecium is all of the carpels together. And we know that flowers can have more than one carpel, right? A carpel is just a single entity where the gynoecium pulls all of those together. So that's kind of the plural. And what parts make up the carpel? You can see at the diagram to the right that you have the stigma, the style, and the ovary. So the stigma being on top, that receives the pollen, the style, which sorts the pollen out when the pollen grows a tube down to the ovary, and then the ovary is here at the bottom. Three, where are the ovules? So they are located in the ovary. That one should have been pretty easy. And then what's the difference between an ovule and a seed? So it's all about whether it's fertilized or not, right? The ovule is an immature, unfertilized seed. And the seed is the fertilized and developed mature ovule, right? So you don't have seeds until after fertilization happens. And that's kind of feeds into our last point, what happens between pollination and fertilization. And so you have, right, pollination, right, where the pollen lands on the stigma at the top of the carpel. And then fertilization happens after that pollen grows a tube down into the ovary and fertilizes the egg. So that's a really important distinction there, right? So pollination is just the transfer of pollen from the anther to the stigma. Fertilization is when the pollen grain grows a pollen tube into the ovary and fertilizes the ovule, right? So it can develop into a seed. Okay, so what happens after fertilization? The seeds develop into fruit. And right, so we kind of left off with fertilization, and then after fertilization happens, the seeds mature and they develop into a fruit. So a fruit in the definition of dendrology is a mature ovary. And it's important to remember that it can contain more than one carpel and thus more than one seed. And we'll see examples of simple fruits and compound fruits. That's a little bit of review. And we'll see examples from lab and also outside of lab. Sometimes tree fruits are not very conspicuous. I want to just click on this YouTube video really quick to show you this process of fruit development. Okay, so that sort of took you through if you had to think about, what happens, how flowers develop into fruits. That showed you real quick. So let's talk about fleshy fruits. That's our focus for today. There are all three of the types that we'll talk about today do look similar from the outside. So you really have to dissect them and look at the parts and determine what's what in order to determine what type of fruit that you have. But basically a quick definition, and we'll look at examples of each of these in a little more detail. A drupe has a single hard pit in the center, right? So that includes all of our stone fruits like peaches and nectarines. It also includes olives. And most of the fruits that we'll look at in dendrology that are fleshy are drupe fruits. So if you're not sure, it says, when in doubt, guess a drupe on your lab quiz. Berries are fleshy throughout, so there's no hard seed anywhere. Blueberries are an example of a berry. There may be seeds that are inside of that berry fruit, and we'll see some examples of that. And then pomes have a papery core, and we'll talk about those in a lot more detail, but an apple, the one that we just looked at the example of, is a good example of a pome. They're all in the Rosaceae family. And then the next lecture, we'll talk about dry fruits. There's several types of those. So back to drupes, right? They have a single hard pit in the center, and they're the most common type of fleshy fruit. We've seen lots of examples of drupes in lab. We saw examples of Ilex decidua, which have that single hard seed in the center, right? The berries turn red in the fall. Some other ones that we've learned recently, Calocarpa americana, American beautyberry. The Ligustrums both have drupe fruits, and Ligustrum lucidum is in fruit right now, so that's one we can see. I think birds ate most of the elderberry fruits that we saw. We should be familiar with black cherries, which have a single drupe, right? The little hard pit in the center of the cherry fruit, and lots of other examples. So you can see some of those examples. Some we've learned in lab already, and some we'll learn later. Importantly, Nyssa sylvatica, and I'll show you a picture of that in just a moment. So Lindera benzoin, or spice bush, is a fruit that turns, a drupe fruit that turns red in the fall. You can see those. And then our ever favorite Toxicodendron radicans. Poison ivy also has a drupe fruit. And those white drupes have a single pit or seed in the center. We can also look at Cornus florida and Cornisone momum. So both of our dogwood fruits that we've learned so far are drupes. So each of those fruits has a single hard seed in the center, right, surrounded by a fleshy exterior, right? And what's the advantage of developing these fleshy exteriors? Well, that can help with dispersal of your fruits. So if you have a tasty fruit, a bird might gobble up that fruit and then go fly off somewhere and poop out the seed, which is indigestible, and then plant it. So I think I gave an example on a video about Calocarpa americana. I have Calocarpa is volunteered in a totally different part of my yard, quite far from the original where it came from. And so probably a bird came and ate the berry and then pooped out the drupe, the seed that was in the center of the drupe to plant that. So fruits are important for dispersal reasons. We also have these really spectacular fruits for Sassafras albinum, if you haven't had a chance to see those. It almost looks like a little goblet. The petiole is kind of swollen and looks like a red goblet, holding little drupes that point upwards that are blue. And then Nyssa sylvatica. This is maybe a surprise. We didn't see this in lab, but Nyssa can develop these paired fruits that are drupes, also with a hard seed in the center surrounded by a fleshy exterior. We have examples of compound drupes. That's when you've got, they can either be a multiple or an aggregate. And we call them drupes, or sometimes drupelets, right? Little drupes. And so what's the difference between those? So an aggregate of drupes, or aggregate of any type of fruit, is one flower that produces many tiny drupes. They're clustered tightly together, so they look like a single fruit. And so an example of that would be raspberries and blackberries, right? If you look at those closely, you can see that there are little teeny drupes, or drupelets, that are clustered together. And so that forms an aggregate of drupes. It looks like a single fruit, but it's actually a compound one. And I'll show you this blackberry development. This is really great. This is one we'll learn in lab rubus or blackberry. So you can see the flower opening up, right? Okay, so each of those tips, I'm just going to pause it for a minute. Each of those tips, those are individual stigmas, right, that are all clustered together, right? So it's a single flower, but each of those stigmas is a carpel, and that will develop into its own little mini druplet. But you can see they're all attached to together, right? So what we're seeing now is those ovaries swelling up into druplets. The stigmas and styles will fall off. And I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit because this is, right? I want it to look like a blackberry to you. Okay, so now you can see just the very little bristles that are left from those stigmas and styles. And you can see the blackberry is now ripening, right? The fruit is ripening into a dark color. It turns red first, but we know that it's not good to eat yet. And then it eventually turns black for the blackberry. So yeah, so it's a really good example of blackberries or rubus sp. We'll learn that in lab. So that is considered an aggregate of drupes, right? We saw there was only one flower that produced many timely druplets because it's multiple carpels. And then on the other end of the spectrum are a multiple of drupes, right? So this is where you have fruits from many different flowers develop closely together to form one larger fruit. And so an example of that we've already learned is Morus alba and Morus rubra. So you have many small flowers, and since they develop closely together, they end up forming a multiple, what we would call a multiple. We also saw an example of sweet gum in lab, and that's also a multiple, although it's a multiple of capsules in this case. So, and here it is pictorially, right? So looking at the flower clusters, comparing an aggregate on the left side, which develops into a blackberry, versus Morus, right? Which develops from multiple flowers that are clustered together, one ovary per flower, right? Just one carpel, but they're clustered together because all those flowers are clustered, right? So this is an example. On the left side, we have an aggregate of druplets or rubus, and on the right, we have a multiple of druplets for Morus, right? So we have single flowers with multiple carpels versus multiple flowers and single carpels. So that's something that I have to think about every time very carefully. And so it'll take a little thought to work through that yourself. So a little bit of tree trivia before we get to our next fruit. Which native North Carolinian tree species has the largest fruit in North America? And this, in this case, this is not a compound fruit, it's a simple fruit. Okay, so the answer is pawpaw, Asimina triloba, which we learned in lab last week. And there's a really great book by Andrew Moore, who's a pawpaw enthusiast who talks a lot about pawpaws. He was at a conference that I went to recently, so it was really great to hear about him celebrate pawpaw as a fruit, which really is an underappreciated native fruit. And a pawpaw is an example of a berry fruit. So the berries are fleshy throughout, and then they have small seeds that are embedded within them. So a couple of berry examples from lab. We have Diospyros virginiana, or in the Ebanaceae family, which is our native persimmon. And those we should be seeing soon. I know places where they have the fruits, but I haven't found any on campus. So that's an example there. We have some our blueberry families that we've learned. We haven't seen, we've only learned Oxydendrum so far, but we're still looking for Vaccinium on campus. Parthenocissus quenquifolia and Muscadinia, or Vitis rotundifolia, it's been renamed to Vitis. You've learned in lab, right? So those, again, those grapes that have seeds throughout the, throughout that berry, it's a type of berry. So those are some examples from lab. And looking at this animations, this is showing the development of persimmon, right? So you just saw the pollen going down into the ovary, the petals fall off. You can still see the sepals are still attached at the bottom. So that's a quick animation there of the development. So a couple berry examples, we have pawpaw, Asimina triloba, and if you get a chance, you should definitely try one. It's a very tropical tasting fruit from this tropical family. And you can see it's a soft flesh, and then these pretty large seeds are embedded throughout the flesh. So something worth trying. And triloba, remember, comes from, this is what the flowers look like. It's really interesting to see. So trilobia, so three-lobed flower petals, as you can see there. And some other examples are Gynoeciums frondosa, this is a huckleberry, and Vaccinium arboreum, which hopefully we'll get a chance to learn. It's in the blueberry family. So again, those are fleshy fruits with small seeds throughout. Blueberries, the seeds are almost indetectable. They taste like a little bit of grit inside the berry if you eat one. And then lastly, let's talk about pome fruits. So pomes are fleshy fruits, and they have a papery core that's actually the ovary. So it has a thin, usually they have a thin skin, and they have this papery cartilaginous structure, and that has the seeds in the center. So in an apple, that's what we call the core of the apple. Often there are always 5 seeds. I think that's always true because these are in the Rosaceae family, which has fruit parts and 5s. Now, the fleshy part of an apple is actually swollen receptacle tissue and not the ovary. The ovary is actually the papery part in the middle. So sometimes you'll hear poems called false fruits because it's really, right, we think about fruit as being the ovary, and it's in there, but it's not all of it. The ovary part is that papery core, which contains the seeds. So like I said, all pomes are in the Rosaceae family, but keep in mind that not all fruits in the Rosaceae are pomes, okay? A couple of examples that we'll have in lab are serviceberry, Amelanchier arborea. And then we also have examples of apples and pears. And here's another animation. Oh, I'm not going to be able to click on it because of the slide thing, but you can click on that if you were looking through the slides later, and it shows the development of a pear from the fruit, or from the flower rather. So this pome fruit development, right, this is the fleshy apple that we all love to eat. This fleshy part is called the hypanthium. I'm not going to get really into that, but you always know that at the bottom of an apple are these little tiny fleshy things. That's the remains of the calyx, right, or the sepals. They're left. The petals fall off as soon as they've attracted their pollinators, but the calyx persists, and those sepals are present. There's 5 of them. And then the core of the apple, right, you can see the seeds here. This is sliced vertically inside of this core, and then this is the flower stalk or the pedicel or peduncle. And so again, this is the ovary here in the center, and then it's surrounded by this fleshy hypanthium. And a couple other things. This is looking at the apple sliced horizontally, so you can see it in cross section. And this is a cool view because you can see these 5 chambers of the ovary, which contain a couple of seeds each. So those are still present. And then the other thing you can sometimes see, and I bet this is something you need to look for next time you eat an apple, is these little 10 dark spots. And so that marks where the 10 stamen bundles attach to the hypanthium and the flowers. So again, right, it's Rosaceae typically has flower parts in 5s or multiples of 5s. And so all pomes are in Rosaceae, but not all Rosaceae fruits are pomes. Here's another example. This is Amelanchier arborea, which if we're not learning yet, we will soon. You can see those little sepals clustered at the ends, right? That's a clue that it's a pome fruit. And so just to wrap up, after fertilization happens, the seeds ripen in the ovary, and that mature ovary develops into fruit. We can classify fruits as fleshy or dry. This lecture focuses on fleshy fruits, and they can be either drupes, berries, or pomes. Drupes are by far the most common fleshy fruit type in trees. They usually have a large seed in the center. And you have single flowers. When we talk about compound fruits, you have single flowers that have a lot of carpels, will develop into aggregates. In this case, we're talking about aggregates of drupes, but we have aggregates of other types of fruits as well. And then if you have a cluster of small flowers, they can develop into a multiple of drupes, right? So they attach and compress together. An example of that is mulberry. And remember that berries are fleshy throughout, and they have smaller seeds within them, but seeds can vary in size. And then finally, pomes or false fruits develop from the receptacle that holds the carpels. So the ovary turns into a papery core that contains the seed, and then it's surrounded by this fleshy receptacle that's often tasty and attracts dispersers of the fruit. So that's all I have for fleshy fruits. And next we'll talk about dry fruits.